Good evening, everyone. I'm hiding behind the, here, I'll step to the side. I'm Kate Harrison, the Dean of the Keese School, and I'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones, if you would, please, before we begin. And I'm going to introduce Don Bliss, who joined the Peace Corps in 1966 after graduating from Harvard Law School, and he was assigned to Micronesia. He was actually the first lawyer to reside in what is now the Federated States of Micronesia. He served as legislative counsel to the Congress of Micronesia and consultant to the government of Samoa. In 2023, almost 60 years later, he and his wife Nancy returned to Micronesia for a month, and the result is his latest book, A Peace Corps Lawyer in Paradise, which is available on Amazon and also right down here at the foot of the stage after the lecture. Tonight's lecture draws from the book and touches on the development of the South Pacific area and what it felt like to return after so many years. I should also add that Don practiced law in Washington, D.C. for more than 43 years, and he has written several books about the law and Mark Twain. Perhaps you remember the Keese lecture on Mark Twain he gave about 2 years ago, I think it was. So please welcome once again, Don Bliss.
Thank you, Kate. It's good to be back. You know the cliche, have a lot of ground to cover tonight? Well, actually, it's a lot of water that I have to cover tonight. My interest in the Pacific Islands began in 1966, as Kay mentioned, when I graduated from law school and applied to the Peace Corps. Are there any former Peace Corps here? Hey, quite a few. That's great. That's great. Wonderful. Well, the Peace Corps came back with an offer to be the first lawyer in a brand new program in the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands in Micronesia. Where? Find me an atlas quick. Wow, the Pacific Ocean covers over a third of the world's surface. All the Earth's land could fit comfortably within the Pacific. Depending on what you count, there are 20 to 30,000 islands in the Pacific Ocean. There's Polynesia, the lighter-skinned and more recently settled, a triangle that goes all the way from Hawaii in the north to Easter Island in the east, and New Zealand, the Maori in New Zealand in the south. And then there's Melanesia, Melanesia ranging from New Guinea to Fiji. The name Melanesia was first used in 1832 by the French navigator Jules Dumont d'Urville, who coined the terms Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia to designate three primary ethnic and geographical regions forming the Pacific. Melanesia comes from the Greek and means island of black people. And finally, there's Micronesia, meaning small islands just north of the equator. Here we find the deepest point on Earth, the Marianas Trench. The Marianas Trench is 7 miles below the Earth's surface. The Pacific average is about 3 miles in depth. Now, I'm going to spend more time on Micronesia, not only because I lived there for 2.5 years and have visited twice since, but because it has a very special relationship with the United States. U.S. interest has ebbed and flowed. But now, with China's aggression in the Pacific, U.S. interest is near an all-time high. War Secretary now, Hegseth, recently visited Micronesia, and it probably wasn't out of concern for rising sea levels. But let's first consider where the islands came from. Many of them sit on hot spots, molten lava between the Earth's mantle, which explodes in volcanic eruptions. For example, the oldest part in Micronesia, the most eastern Marshall Islands, experienced volcanic eruptions some 70 million years ago. The extinct volcanoes slowly sank under their own weight at about 1 millimeter a year and are now totally submerged. As the volcanoes sank, fringed coral reefs clung to their side. The animal, coral, grew on hard bottoms fed by the oxygen from breaking waves and in a symbiotic relationship with plant algae, which thrives in the sunlight of shallow water, giving the coral its sparkling color and providing a rich marine environment. What remains of the Marshalls today are barrier reefs around large lagoons, 29 atolls, 5 low flat islands with poor soil and sparse water scattered among 750,000 square miles of ocean. Sandy beaches were created by tropical storms. And yes, the poop of parrotfish. Kindly ignore that factoid the next time you take a trip to the beach. Now, the formation of the Caroline Islands in Micronesia, like Pohnpei and Kauai, and Tahiti in French Polynesia, represent the second stage of hot spot evolution. High volcanic islands with substantial rainfall and soil fertilized by minerals from volcanic rock. As the extinct volcano gradually sinks, a fringe reef and small lagoon, as in Kauai, or a barrier reef and larger lagoon, as in Tahiti and Pohnpei, encircle the island. A purer example can be found in the Hawaiian archipelago. The chain of islands ends with the big island, Hawaii, and its active volcanoes. Moving northwest along the hotspot, the islands are progressively older and smaller, ending in a series of underwater peaks. Now here's a trivia question. You can shout out the answer. What is the tallest mountain on Earth? Everest. I always hear Everest. But no, the answer is Mauna Kea in Hawaii. It's 10,205 meters from its base, but only 4,205 are above sea level. Now, where do these islanders come from? For years, shrouded in mystery and debate, the populating of hundreds of islands in the Pacific is one of history's great migration stories. By sailing his raft, Kon-Tiki from Peru to Easter Island, behind the east to west prevailing winds, Norwegian Thor Heyerdahl hoped to demonstrate that early settlers originated in Latin America. However, recent research has largely discredited Heyerdahl's theory. Language similarities rooted in the Austronesian languages that range all the way from Madagascar to Easter Island, artifacts and culture, radiocarbon dating, and DNA testing have now traced the origin to the indigenous tribes of Taiwan. For thousands of years, voyagers from Taiwan migrated throughout the Pacific, occupying habitable islands from New Guinea to the Galapagos, bringing with them similar customs, plants and animals, tools, and languages. In Melanesia, they mingled with people speaking Papuan languages, arriving even earlier during the Ice Age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower and land bridges connected Indonesia, New Guinea, and Australia. Then, beginning some 4,000 years ago, the Taiwanese people who settled in Melanesia built canoes from palm trees, the rope from coconut husks, sap from the breadfruit trees, and triangular crab claw sails from woven mats of salt-resistant pandanus leaves. They set sail for Micronesia and Polynesia, navigating by the stars and sea swells, bird flights, weather patterns, and cloud and sea colors. Suppressed by the missionaries and local culture, including traditional navigation skills, almost completely disappeared. But in the 1970s, there was a resurgence of interest in indigenous culture. A group in Hawaii enlisted Mau Pialug, who led a school of master sailors in a remote Micronesian atoll to navigate a double-hulled outrigger from Hawaii to Tahiti, demonstrating the feasibility of sailing by the stars and sea swells across vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. When the Hokulea arrived in Tahiti in 1976, having sailed 2,500 miles over 31 days, it was met by a crowd of 17,000 in Papeete Harbor, and today, dozens of double hulls traverse the ocean using traditional navigation skills. You may have seen the movie Moana if you have great-grandchildren or grandchildren, which has popularized these legendary voyages. Now, given our typically Eurocentric viewpoint, we tend to attribute discovery of the Pacific Islands to European explorers, when in fact discovery is best claimed by the dauntless outrigger voyagers. For better or for worse, however, Western influence began with Ferdinand Magellan, the first European navigator to cross the Pacific, having experienced shipwreck, mutiny, scurvy, starvation, and eventually death en route. Magellan landed in Guam in Micronesia in 1521. The most influential Pacific explorer was Captain James Cook, who left the merchant marines to join the Royal Navy, and through sheer brilliance that defied the class structure, rose to command 3 critical voyages to Australia, New Zealand, Tahiti, and many other islands before his untimely death in Hawaii in 1779. During his first voyage on the Endeavour in 1768, a scientific excursion planned to measure the transit of Venus across the sun, he met a Polynesian navigator, Tupaia, who shared traditional navigation skills and geographic knowledge that enabled Cook to find and visit numerous Pacific islands. Spanish, German, Russian, British, French, Australian, and American explorers undertook many excursions to the Pacific Islands during the 18th and 19th centuries in search of resources and trade, too often bringing conflict and Western communicable diseases that decimated the local populations. They were followed by whalers and missionaries. For example, in 1854, the American whale ship Delta brought the scourge of smallpox to Pohnpei, and the population declined by 40%. Before returning to Micronesia, I'll say a few words about the other island groupings. Melanesia includes 4 independent countries: Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea. It also includes the Indonesian part of New Guinea and New Caledonia, which is a French colony. There are 1,319 languages in Melanesia, which are either Austronesian or Papuan. It's by far the densest collection of distinct languages on Earth. Southwest of New Guinea lies a chain of island atolls and reefs forming the perimeter of the Coral Sea, remembered for that critical naval battle, a turning point in World War II. For Americans, Melanesia often reminds us of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, Bougainville, and Papua New Guinea for the significant battles of the Pacific theater. Now, in 2023, the Solomons, a member of the British Commonwealth, sent the U.S. a wake-up call when its former president visited President Xi in Beijing and signed a confidential secret pact on security and police cooperation with China. In New Caledonia, riots were recently suppressed when the indigenous Kanak people objected to an agreement that would have given French settlers disproportionate voting power. And in Vanuatu, crises have come mostly from Mother Nature, including earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, cyclones, and tsunamis. The Republic of Fiji, with over 300 islands, a population of almost 1 million, and a land area the size of New Jersey, is among the most developed of the Pacific Islands. Descendants of indentured laborers from India brought by the British to work the sugar plantations constitute about 37% of the population today. Many Indo-Fijians left during times of strife, but things have settled down, and today Fiji is a major tourist destination. New Guinea is the second largest island in the world. The independent state of Papua, occupying the eastern half, is a member of the British Commonwealth and has a population probably approaching 17 million, many of whom live in remote, rural, mountainous areas. Leaving Melanesia, we arrive in Polynesia, the most recently settled of the island groups, with a commonality of language and culture. Its heart is French Polynesia, an overseas territory of France, with 121 islands and atolls and 5 archipelagos covering an ocean area about the size of France. But Papeete, the capital of Tahiti, is French Polynesia's largest island, is a bustling city embedded in a volcanic island of rugged mountain peaks, verdant valleys, dazzling waterfalls, black sand beaches, and a sophisticated population. While Tahiti is supposedly semi-autonomous with an elected parliament which selects a prime minister, there is a French high commissioner who can and has fired the prime minister, and there is a substantial French bureaucracy. There is a simmering resentment of French oversight, accompanied by some trepidation whether following the independence route of so many other island nations is economically sustainable. In 2013, the United Nations General Assembly restored French Polynesia to its decolonization list. And in 2023, for the first time, the pro-independence party won a majority of parliament and elected a prime minister for a 5-year term. While favoring the long-term goal of independence, the prime minister allayed some fears by declaring he was unable to get a referendum on independence from France for another 10 to 15 years. In the fast-changing geopolitical dynamics of the Pacific Islands, the issue of decolonization and independence for several of the islands in Polynesia and Melanesia bears watching as it is fueled by an aggressive Chinese propaganda machine. The cultural heart of Polynesia is Raiatuia, the site of the ancient Mare Taputapupuatia. The site is the most important temple in Polynesia at the center of the triangle. Chiefs, priests, navigators, and warriors traveled from all over Polynesia to engage in occult rituals at the Mare, which was dedicated to the god of life and death, Oro. For many decades, the site was neglected and overgrown, but archaeological remains were restored in 1994, and work to preserve this UNESCO World Heritage Site continues. Polynesia also includes independent islands affiliated with New Zealand, such as the beautiful Niue, the Cook Islands, Western Samoa, and the proud Maori of New Zealand. The mysterious Maui of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island as we know it, have the 900 or so statues averaging 13 feet tall. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and that is a territory of Chile. And then there's American Samoa, a U.S. territory since 1898, and the enchanting Kingdom of Tonga, the only major island never to have been colonized. But now let's return to Micronesia. Micronesia has 11 distinct languages and cultures. It was occupied during various historical periods by the Spanish, Germans, Japanese, and Americans. In 1885, Pope Leo XIII awarded Spain sovereignty over the Carolines. In 1899, the Treaty of Paris ended the Spanish-American War, and Spain sold the Marshalls, Carolines, and Marianas to Germany for $6 million. Guam, the largest island in Micronesia, however, became a U.S. territory, which it remains today. After World War I, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Carolines were transferred to Japan under the Treaty of Versailles in satisfaction of German war debts to be governed under a League of Nations mandate prohibiting military bases. Contrary to the mandate, the Japanese quickly moved to integrate the islands into its economic and military empire. After the hard-fought battles of the Pacific Theater, the United States administered the Marianas, Carolines, and Marshalls under a United Nations trusteeship. Guam remained a U.S. territory. The trust territory of the Pacific Islands encompasses 2,044 uninhabited and 97 inhabited volcanic high islands and coral atolls just north of the equator. It's up here, yeah. It covers an ocean area larger than the continental United States, but the land area, the total land area is only 2/3 the size of Rhode Island, so these are tiny islands. The Mariana Islands, the northernmost chain, the Caroline Islands include Palau, Yap, Pohnpei, Chuuk, and Kasrai, and finally the Marshall Islands are halfway between Australia and Hawaii. When the U.S. took over from the Japanese, economic development was neglected. Electricity was replaced with kerosene lanterns, and the rails and roads built by the Japanese were covered with jungle. Americans neglected the economic development but did a better job in education, set up a judicial system, and a pathway to learning self-government. Nevertheless, negative reports to the United Nations Trusteeship Council alerted President Kennedy to U.S. malfeasance. As an expeditious and cost-effective response, Kennedy ordered Peace Corps volunteers to the islands. Thus, in 1966, I was the first lawyer to reside in what is today the Federated States of Micronesia. My Peace Corps posting was in the rugged, multi-peak volcanic island of Pohnpei, known as the Garden of Micronesia. Pohnpei's 26,000 people inhabit lush jungles, fertile soils, and luxuriant foliage fed by daily rainfalls up to 400 inches annually in the interior, which give birth to hidden waterfalls and sparkling rainbows. Its coastline is bordered by thick mangrove swamps, which face out to a turquoise lagoon and a barrier reef of multicolored coral and abundant sea life. One might argue that until the fall of 1966, Pohnpei was a paradise without any lawyers living there. But in September 1966, after several plane and ocean freighter trips, I finally arrived in Pohnpei. I sat alone behind my metal desk in the office assigned to me in a Quonset hut, the dilapidated building with corrugated metal siding rusting away was a relic of the U.S. Navy's occupation of Micronesia after the war, and it was the courthouse in Colonia, the capital of the Pohnpei district. As I brushed the ants off my typewriter and welcomed a chicken entering the room, I asked myself, what the hell am I going to do now? The answer came quickly. Yoster Carl, the Pohnpeian public defender, a bright, curious, and hard-working high school graduate who had received 6 weeks of legal training, knocked on my door, introduced himself, and said he had a problem. Bilipo Johnny, a young man from Nucor, an isolated atoll several miles south of Pohnpei, had gotten drunk on tuba, fermented from the sap of coconut tree flower buds. The inebriated Bilipo engaged in disorderly and destructive conduct and was arrested and tried by a community judge chosen for his stature in the community, but not his legal education, of which he had none. Bilipo was sentenced to a month in jail and shipped to Colonia to serve time. For some reason, the commitment order to the district sheriff said 6 months. 31 days had passed, but Sheriff Tomasiano Martin would not release him. What could we do to help this guy? Fortunately, the remedy of habeas corpus was enshrined in the Bill of Rights of the Trust Territory Code. Habeas corpus is the petition to the custodian of a person who may be unlawfully imprisoned to bring the prisoner to court to determine whether the detention is lawful. I grabbed a musty law book off the shelf, generously provided by the New York Bar Association, and Yoster and I drafted a writ of habeas corpus, which we served on the sheriff. The next day, Sheriff Martin showed up in my office with the petition in hand. What is this? I heard you wrote it. Oh, oops, I got a problem. Do we have any lawyers out here in the audience? Anybody willing to admit you've been a lawyer? Well, if you're a lawyer, you understand my problem. You know what I'm talking about. Pretty foundational in a lawyer's ethical obligations. You can't represent opposing parties in the same manner. But I was the only lawyer in Pohnpei. There was no one to whom I could refer the sheriff. So Tomasiano and I drafted a response, which was filed with the court. That night, I sent a telegram to the U.S.-appointed Chief Justice Ed Ferber of the High Court in the Trust Territory of Saipan. in Saipan in the Mariana Islands, and I explained the situation, offered a solution, and requested guidance. As the only lawyer in Pohnpei, I thought it would be unfair of me to represent only one side. I thought my role should be as a teacher to help all in the community who needed legal help in understanding and working within the U.S.-imposed legal system, and to render such assistance in an objective and neutral way. The Chief Justice responded quickly, endorsing my approach. It was a good thing, too, because the next day, the clerk of courts, Judah Johnny, came to see me. He said, "Presiding Judge Kohler of the Pohnpei District would like to see me in his office." Judah and I promptly entered the judge's chambers on the other side of the Quonset hut. The dignified judge was a Nanmarki, a native chief of partial German descent. He showed me the two documents and asked me what he should do. I said simply, invite the public defender and sheriff into your courtroom and ask them to explain the situation, and then do what you think is right. The judge did so, and everyone agreed that the prisoner should be released. In an abundance of caution, I did not even go to the hearing. Elated, Bilipo Johnny was soon on his way back to Nucor on the freighter MVS Casalelia, where he had some mending to do with his family and neighbors. Yoster, the sheriff, the clerk of courts, and Judge Kohler appreciated learning about a new tool in their arsenal of rendering justice. But it was the young Peace Corps lawyer who learned the most. As is often the case in the Peace Corps experience, I learned the practical and very human implications of applying law school theory in resolving conflicts in the most fundamental setting. For a recent law school graduate, what was fascinating about trust territory law was seeing how law evolves from local custom and traditions. What are the remedies under traditional Micronesian culture, for example, if one person harms another? And it doesn't matter whether the harm is intentional, negligent, or accidental. What values are truly universal and should be applied even if they're contrary to the customary way of handling things? The three-justice High Court in Saipan, led by Chief Justice Ferber, did a pretty good job of respecting local custom except where it contravenes universal norms, such as those embedded in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. So let's fast forward to Micronesia today. The Northern Marianas today are a U.S. Commonwealth, like Puerto Rico. Its capital, Saipan, was the site of a decisive invasion in World War II. The island of Tinian was the taking-off point for the B-29s, the Enola Gay and Boxcar carrying Little Boy and Fat Man, the atomic bombs that ended the war. It took off from Tinian. Pohnpei, Kaswai, Chuk, and Yap are in the Carolines. They became states in the Independent Federated States of Micronesia, the FSM. The brand new capital, Palikar, is located in northwest Pohnpei. The leaders of the FSM negotiated a compact of free association with the United States, which the FSM voters approved in 1983. Similar compacts were negotiated with Palau and the Marshalls. These compacts established the FSM, Palau, and the Marshalls as associated free states in political union with the United States. The agreement grants each state the right of self-governance, but provides the U.S. with exclusive rights to develop, explore, and exploit natural resources and exclusive access to their land and waterways for strategic purposes. In return, the U.S. provides the states with economic assistance, defends their territorial integrity, provides access to U.S. markets, education and healthcare opportunities, and unrestricted travel to the United States. In March of 2024, President Biden signed into law a 20-year extension of these three Micronesian compacts, authorizing $7.1 billion in assistance for environmental protection and climate adaptation, education, healthcare security, and so forth. The FSM receives $140 million annually from the U.S. Hundreds of Micronesians have served in the U.S. Armed Forces, attended school in the United States. On March 27th of this year, our Defense Secretary again signed a bilateral agreement with the FSM president at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam that will provide for the construction of military facilities and infrastructure in the islands. Strategically, the U.S. considers Micronesia part of the outer perimeter of defense against Chinese aggression. The inner perimeter includes the Philippines, Taiwan, and Okinawa, all of which are vulnerable to geopolitical challenges and Chinese attack. The central hub of the outer perimeter is Guam, which remains a U.S. territory. The U.S. is spending $8 billion under this administration to build an anti-missile Star Wars-type defense system to protect the growing Air Force, Naval, Marine, and Coast Guard presence in Guam. Now, the Republic of Palau, also a compact state, has a population of 18,000, one of the smallest states in the United Nations, but it has the same vote as China and India, and it usually aligns with the U.S. position. Palau is the site of the beautiful Rock Islands and a top scuba diving destination. The Palau Marine Sanctuary was the world's first marine protected area and one of the largest in the world, covering 80% of Palau's national waters. To illustrate the ebb and flow of U.S. relations with Micronesia, I'm going to tell a story out of turn, and don't repeat this to anybody else, okay? Shortly after I left the Peace Corps, Marine Commandant General Walt visited Palau, then the Trust Territory, and met with the local chiefs. He asked whether they would welcome a U.S. military base to train Marines in the jungle warfare for Vietnam. As required by traditional culture, the elderly chiefs extended a warm welcome, and General Walt so testified in Congress. This made the Washington Post and the Hawaiian newspapers, sending shockwaves through the Palau legislature, which consisted of young Palauans, some recently educated in the U.S., where the anti-protest movement was in full force. The U.S.-created legislature went to their Peace Corps lawyer and asked him to draft a resolution stating that under no circumstances would Palau accept a military base in its precious and scarce land. The resolution overwhelmingly passed and made the newspapers in the U.S. embarrassing General Walt, who then found out who had drafted the resolution. With White House help, the Peace Corps lawyer program in Micronesia was suspended. Now fast forward to 2025, where the Defense Department has multiple projects completed and ongoing in Palau, including airfields in Peleliu and Anguar, sites of ferocious Pacific Theater battles, a state-of-the-art radar facility, intelligence gathering facility, and a Coast Guard base. Palau is the site of frequent U.S. military exercises. So to quote Bob Dylan, the times they are a-changin'. The Republic of the Marshall Islands, also a compact state, has a complicated relationship to the U.S. military. In January 1944, as part of MacArthur's plan to return to the Philippines, U.S. Marine and Army troops launched an amphibious assault on Kwajalein Atoll, where the Japanese had established their outermost defense perimeter. Since the 1950s, the U.S. military has leased Kwajalein for a missile testing and tracking site, including orbital rocket launches and the operation of its GPS system. But between 1946 and 1958, after displacing resident Marshallese, the U.S. detonated 67 atmospheric and underwater nuclear weapons tests, 23 at Bikini and 44 at Enewetak Atoll. As a result, the Marshallese suffer from health and environmental effects, including elevated cancer rates and displacement from contaminated areas. In 1986, the Marshallese received a $150 million compensation. However, the islanders and advocacy groups assert that this is inadequate to cover the full cost of the harm done. Discussions are ongoing. Now, not all of Micronesia has a history of U.S. administration. The Gilbert Islands has a history of was a British colony until 1979, when they became the independent nation of Kiribati. It's spelled Kiribati, but it's Kiribati. A chain of 33 coral atolls. Its capital, Tarawa, was the site of a significant but costly U.S. victory in the Pacific Theater in 1943. It was the cost of 1,600 Marines and sailors killed or missing and 2,000 wounded, one of the worst battles of the Pacific. Kiribati is the only country in all 4 hemispheres, north, south, east, and west, and it likely will be the first nation totally submerged by rising sea levels. With rising sea levels, Chinese aggression, and the resurgence of indigenous cultures, the islands of the Pacific have been gaining increased U.S. attention. While the population and land areas are small, they cover a vast expanse of the Earth's surface, and they embrace fascinating cultures. While U.S. interest is largely motivated by strategic concerns, the good news is the Peace Corps is returning to Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Vanuatu, and Palau, and is considering a return to the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshalls, and hopefully the Solomons. For Westerners, the Pacific Islands, especially Melanesia, may seem the most primitive cultures in the world. So I'd like to close with a story by a young married Peace Corps volunteer couple who arrived in a remote village in the highlands of Papua New Guinea in 1996. And I quote from their story. We were the first Peace Corps volunteers ever in Maiamafu. We were greeted by a large group of people wearing gorgeous, curious smiles, giggling naked children hid behind trees during the trek down the mountain to our new home. We had just been adopted by a large and unique family. There were no cars, electricity, or telephones, just grass huts, large gardens, and a whole lot of rainforest. The village lived in harmony with its natural surroundings for a millennium. The villagers built us a beautiful bamboo-thatched hut on short stilts. Planted behind the house was a 3-acre garden with a bounty of dozens of vegetables and fruits. Mamiafu was a preserved example of communal living. Men rallied to the building of a new home. The elderly worked and lived with their families. The one parentless Down syndrome man was fed, housed, and clothed by everyone. After we had settled and we were sitting in a circle on the ground with a large group of villagers to talk story, Papua New Guinea's favorite pastime of telling stories. I passed around photos I'd snapped back home in Chicago. A villager was staring intently at one of the photos. He spotted 2 homeless men on Michigan Avenue on the sidewalk with signs propped between their legs. "Tula men wakamonam," he asked. "What are these 2 men doing?" I attempted to explain homelessness to the group and the desire of these 2 men to get some food. Crowding around the photograph, the villagers could not comprehend how the men became homeless or why the passerbyers were so indifferent. They bombarded me with questions, trying to make sense of the 2 ragged beggars in the midst of glittering skyscrapers. They concluded that the men lacked not only food and shelter, but a general sense of affection and purpose in their community. Early the next morning, we were startled by a sharp rap on the door. Opening it, I was greeted by 3 elders. We went out into the bright, beautiful day and sat in a circle. Moya spoke first. "After you left last night, the village council had a meeting. We discussed the 2 men in your picture, and we have a proposal for you." We wondered what it could possibly be. "Please contact these 2 men and your government. Ask the government to fly them to Mamiafu just like they did for you. We have marked 2 spots of land where our men will build houses and the women will plant the gardens to feed them." I was stunned and overwhelmed. Their offer was bold and genuine. It was innocent and naive. My worldview completely changed. What does one say to such an offer? We stumbled over explanations of difficult logistics, scarce money, government bureaucracies, but the councilmen would not accept no for an answer. In their lives, it was impossible to comprehend that humanity was host to such an injustice. They wanted action. We reluctantly matched their enthusiasm with a few letters to America. We toured the sites where the homes were to be built and the gardens planted. The plan could not work, we told them. Their hearts sank, and I could see in their eyes that this dream would not die easily. "We are very sorry that this can't happen," they said. they shook their heads in disappointment. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for questions and answers. Just raise your hand and one of the questions will come to the microphone. Okay.
There seems to be a certain amount of interest in this product recently. Do any of the islands show signs of having rare earth? Is that what I'm supposed to say, rare earth minerals?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a number of opportunities for the exploration of rare earth minerals under the sea. As you probably know, the United States is not a signatory to the Treaty on the Law of the Sea. I think we're only one of 2 or 3 nations that haven't signed on to it, which provides a mechanism for getting permits to do deep sea mining of rare minerals. And there are some projects off New Guinea. They're all very controversial because environmentalists are very concerned about the disruption of the seabed. Interestingly, a U.S.-Canadian company has a contract with Nauru, which is a small island which is a signatory to the Law of the Sea, so that they can do some deep-sea mining of possible rare earth minerals in these modules in the deep Pacific off the island. Now, technically, the U.S. is not permitted to get permits because we're not a signatory to the Law of the Sea. I think there have been comments in this administration that we might just do it anyway, but for the most part, the mechanism provided under the Law of the Sea provides for environmental safeguards in the permitting process and so forth. So, yes, there is an opportunity, particularly in deep sea mining. And there are also probably in New Guinea, there's some examples of rare minerals in New Guinea as well that haven't been fully developed.
We can assume that the residents of Guam are American residents, are American citizens. What about the situation in the other islands? Are there other islands where they are American citizens?
Yes, the Guamanians are American citizens. Micronesians are not American citizens, but they have the right to travel without visa in the United States and to resettle in the U.S., and many of them have. In fact, Micronesia is losing population. There are large communities of Micronesians in North Carolina, in Arkansas, in Oregon, in California, and about 20,000 in Hawaii, where they think they may have a better opportunity. And a lot of these have not worked out very well. There are a number of Micronesians who find it difficult to adapt to U.S. culture, to find a good job, and so forth. In fact, there was one unfortunate study recently that showed the suicide rate among Micronesians increased sixfold between 1970 and 2024. So the process of resettlement in the U.S. has not gone all that well. So technically they're not citizens, but they also have access to many of as of this recent law in 2024 that Biden signed, they have access to supplemental security income and a number of Pell Grants and a number of programs as well.
I was just curious, how are they doing? Are they having any problems losing their coral reefs like they are worldwide?
Yes, I think, coral reefs protection of coral reefs are really important. And that's why it's so interesting that Palau, the Republic of Palau, 80% of its Palauan waters, that's 230 miles into the economic zone and so forth, is a protected marine sanctuary. And they're doing everything to, I don't know if you remember the picture of the Rock Islands, it's just a beautiful place, and they're doing everything they can to protect their islands and the coral reefs and so forth. But that is a dramatic example of where they're probably way ahead of us in terms of what they're willing to do to protect their environment, protect the coral. But yes, it is a problem.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. It's so far-reaching. Is there any time frame for the islands going underwater and plan ahead for relocating?
Because of rising seas? Well, I think they're all very conscious of it. The Pacific Island Forum consists of most of the island nations in the Pacific, and they're very active in the United Nations and the signatories to the Paris Accord and so forth, working both on the issue of reducing the effect of carbon on climate change, but also mitigation of the effect of climate change. And in fact, for example, Kiribati, I mentioned Kiribati, which has one of the highest birth rates. I think the highest point in Kiribati is maybe 4 meters at most, and it's mostly about 2 meters above sea level. So we're talking about 30 different atolls, and they're very crowded, and their water is totally contaminated because the salt and sewage is seeped in. Most of their water comes from catchments from the rain, and it's become totally contaminated. So they are very much trying to mitigate this damage, but it is a hugely expensive and difficult proposition for them. And the U.S. is funding a saltwater desalinization plant in Tarawa, but it's like $8 million, and it's really going to only help that one atoll because you've got these other atolls that are so hard to reach and so forth. So, yeah, they're very conscious of this. USAID had a number of programs that were dedicated to trying to deal with mitigating the effects of rising sea levels and climate change, but I assume that they mostly have been terminated at this point.
I was very fortunate recently to take a trip to Papua New Guinea. It was on my bucket list. I wanted to see the birds of paradise. And so I took myself off there, much against my family's wishes. They showed me videos. They did all sorts of things to convince me that was not a safe place to go for a woman alone, but I went anyway. I saw, I think, 6 birds of paradise out in the wilds, but then I also went to aviaries where they had many, and so saw many in the aviaries. And I had with me a bird book, which most travelers around the world want to have at least that. If they haven't got it on their cell phones, at least take a book with you. And at the end of my trip to this aviary, very large aviary, I saw many birds of paradise there, but they told me they'd not been able to mate them. There'd been no successful mating program because they don't mate in confined spaces. So at the end of it, he turned to me and he thanked me for coming, and he said, "I've learned a lot from you." And I looked at him and thought, what did he learn from me? I knew nothing about birds of paradise. And he said, "Well, because you have the book." And I said, "You don't have a book?" And he said, "No." So when I left, I made sure that I got that book to him. So he had it.
Right.
So, yeah, but it was a wonderful, wonderful trip, and extraordinary people that live there. The one thing I was told, do not go beyond the borders of the hotel or wherever I was staying. Do not go alone anywhere. You travel only with somebody from the hotel.
Right.
And so, believe me, I did just precisely that. But I ended up in the Western Highlands, way up 8,000 odd feet. And they treated me like family. We've got a cousin down the road who has a farm there. Would you like to come with us? I wasn't allowed to go through the jungle on my own, but they took us to the cousin's farm. They took us to an orchid farm. It took me. I was alone. So it was an amazing trip, an amazing experience. Very friendly people, but don't push your luck.
Right. Well, that's one. Bird of paradise is very important in a lot of the cultures. There are many different cultures, obviously, in New Guinea and so forth. A friend of ours always likes to tell the story that when she went to New Guinea, you come to a fork in the road. And, like Yogi Berra says, when you come to a fork in the road, you take it. If you go left, you're going to be served a delicious dinner. But if you go right, you're going to be a delicious dinner.
I have a question. Having been in the Peace Corps in Samoa for 2 years, I'm interested to hear about your personal Peace Corps experience in terms of did you have language training? What was your day-to-day sort of life? What did you do during the day to pass the time? Just more details about how long you were there, actually. Was it 2 years or?
Well, okay. Well, thank you for the question. How much time do we have? it was a transformative experience. I'm sure you felt the same way about the Peace Corps. But since I was the only lawyer, and I said a little bit about it, but I worked with anybody that needed help in understanding how the U.S. legal system functions, and we're trying to introduce the rule of law because we thought the rule of law was essential to economic development. That's the way the U.S. approaches things, we hope. And so I worked with the companies that were exporting or importing that had problems with their companies, foreign companies. But I worked with the district legislature in helping them understand how the process works and drafting legislation. And then during the trust territory at that time, there was a Congress of Micronesia that had just been established, and they were learning how self-government works. And so I was a legislative counsel to the Congress of Micronesia. I stayed on after the Peace Corps for another 3 months to work with that Congress. It was so interesting, drafting bills and legislation. And so it was a variety of things. My last 6 months, because my replacement came to Pohnpei, I clerked for one of the justices on the High Court, and we rode the circuit. And this gave me a chance to visit all the other islands, Yap and the Marshall Islands and so forth. So that was fun working with the judge. And then I think working with the Congress of Micronesia was quite exciting. I told the story out of turn about the one Peace Corps lawyer. We had such independence, and the U.S. government was very supportive, never really ever criticized me, even though a lot of the things I was asked to do probably were not what the U.S. would have preferred. But we had to know where to draw the line. For example, if somebody asked me to draft a resolution or a bill, I wanted to make sure they knew exactly what they wanted. I wasn't going to try to put words in their mouths. So, for example, when Senator Hiroshi Ishmael of Kusai, it's not Korsai, it was Kusai when I was there. He was a wonderful man, good friend, and he said, Kusai didn't have an airport, and he said he wanted me to draft a resolution urging the Department of Interior to build an airport in Kusai. And I said, fine, what are the reasons? What are the reasons that you need an airport? And he said, well, we have citrus fruit that we can make available to the rest of Micronesia. We have wonderful orange trees and lime trees, and for medical evacuations, and also to import things that we need. We get a freighter, a ship comes once every 3 months, So we get the mail, and it would give us much more a connection to the rest of Micronesia to have this airport. And so I said, well, what about tourism? And he looks at me and he says, I'll shoot the first damn tourist that steps a foot on my island. I hope that answers your question. It was really fun, yeah.
Some years ago, I met a Samoan that was a representative of some sort in our Congress. How standardized is that connection, or was that a one-off situation?
Okay,
A Samoan that was in our
yeah.
Congress as a representative of Samoa.
In what conference?
Ours, the U.S. Congress.
Congress. Oh, I got you. Oh, yes. Well, the American Samoa is a U.S. territory. I'm sorry, and like Guam, and it has a representative in the U.S. Congress, non-voting representative. Her name is Amata Kabui, and her father, Peter Coleman, was. No, her name is Amata Radawagan, and her father was Peter Coleman. That's her married name. And she's been the representative from Samoa in the U.S. Congress for 25 years or more. Her father was the first indigenous governor of American Samoa. He's Samoan. And then he became High Commissioner of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. But he's very highly well-respected throughout the Pacific. And so she served in that capacity as representative to the U.S. Congress, and is very knowledgeable. I actually worked with her when I was in the government for a while, and we used to call it HEW. But she's, but she has no vote, but can nevertheless present the issues of the American territory so far away from the U.S. and what their needs and requirements are.
I wonder how much you could tell us about the efforts of the United States to mitigate the health and environmental impacts of all the testing in the Marshall Islands. I knew a Peace Corps volunteer who was there 20 or 25 years ago, and she came back pretty discouraged about the prospects for getting the assistance that they need.
Yes, well, the Marshall Islands were in this last bill that was passed in 2024 in March. They were the last ones to sign on to the extension of the Compact of Free Association for 20 years because they had these issues. Some of them relate back to the nuclear testing and so forth and the effects of that. Marshalls are really difficult because they're atolls, you know, they're very small and they're spread out over a lot of water, and it's very expensive to get from one place to another. So, but assuming Congress goes forward with what has been authorized in this bill, they should receive substantial U.S. subsidies that would be used for to improve the health care of the Marshallese. A lot of it is focused on, the money is focused on health care, on not only because of the effects of the nuclear radiation, but also just generally the issues of health care they have to deal with in these islands. So the U.S. is putting a fair amount of money, given the small populations of these places, and assuming Congress continues to appropriate that money over the next 20 years, it is a priority from the U.S. standpoint.
We have time for one or two more questions. Anyone else?
I've got a question. Could you compare the colonial government? Hang on, your mic is on. Could you compare the colonial government of the Japanese? Yeah. Could you compare the colonial government of the Japanese to the colonial government of the Americans in the trust territories? How do the people there compare the two?
How the people reacted to Japanese and U.S. administration?
Yeah, well, how did they compare the two in terms of how it benefited them, how efficient they were, et cetera?
Well, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I would say, as I mentioned in my talk, that the Japanese really developed Micronesia to a large extent. They had electricity in many of the islands, they had roads, they even have railroads in some of them. And after the U.S. Navy took over and during the war, so much of it was bombed out during the war, so the place was a mess. And during the war, the Micronesians were treated like slaves by the Japanese. I mean, as the embargoes that the U.S. put on the islands meant that people were starving, and of course the Micronesians were the farthest down on the ladder. The Japanese were first, and then the Korean workers and Okinawan workers and others came next. And so they were treated terribly by the Japanese, especially during the war. So I think that the feeling of the Micronesians is that the Japanese did a lot for their economic development, and if you were a wealthy Micronesian, you could participate in the benefits of that economic development. And then the Americans let it deteriorate, and then over the period of the last 15, 20 years, we've done a lot better in some places than others in economic development in the islands. And now our focus seems to be primarily on security. So to the extent to which to ensure a good relationship with these islands, we have to help them with their economic development. That's a priority. But I'd say they didn't like dealing with the Japanese. The Japanese were quite oppressive. But the style of life, for at least the ones that were better off, was a lot better with the Japanese than it was at first with the Americans. I mean, my wife, who I met in the Peace Corps, is in the audience someplace, tells a story that one of the judges in Chuk, they put on a kerosene lantern to have dinner, and she said, well, what did you do before you had kerosene lantern? She said, well, we used to have electricity. I mean, we had roads and electricity. Under the Japanese. So, you know, and it was difficult because the older population spoke Japanese and their native language, and then the younger people speak English. So many of the jobs with the U.S. administration went to the younger people who were English speaking. So as the new generation then took hold, they were much more supportive of the United States. One of the interesting things is that Palau and the Marshalls are two of the 4 places now in the Pacific that recognize Taiwan, Taipei, instead of China, whereas the Federated States of Micronesia recognizes the People's Republic, not Taiwan. So that's one of the sort of barometers of where their allegiances lie.
Thank you so much, Don. Well, in case you didn't know there was trouble in paradise, I guess we know that now, don't we? Thank you, Don, for sharing your really depth of knowledge about so many things, and particularly this evening for this part of the world. It was wonderful. Thank you. So next Thursday, November 6th, we will have the pleasure of hearing about a pioneering female journalist named Eliza Skidmore. Born just before the Civil War, Eliza traveled the world during her reporting career, but she will probably be most remembered for the major role she played in bringing to Washington its famous Japanese cherry trees. Our speaker will be Diana Parcell, the author of the book, Eliza Skidmore, the trailblazing journalist behind Washington's